Henry Kissinger has now completed his memoirs in a book called Years of Renewal. The book takes the reader from the departure of Richard Nixon from the White House in August of 1974 to the departure of Gerald Ford from the White House 2.5 years later. During those hectic years, the country lived through multiple crises. And during those years, Dr. Kissinger served as Secretary of State and primary conceptualist of our foreign policy. Henry Kissinger's spectacular career is familiar to everyone interested in public affairs, which means familiar to everyone who views his program. We know that he came as a boy refugee from Nazi Germany, that he was a dazzling professor at Harvard and a productive scholar, that he was at the right hand of Presidents Nixon and Ford, and that he had written White House years and years of upheaval before undertaking this final book of memoirs. He brought out a scholarly book on the history of diplomacy just 4 years ago, and of course he is a familiar figure on television and as a columnist. What is not so generally understood is his extraordinary talents as a writer. Most Americans have had discouraging experiences with one or more historians who tell us what happened but who fail to enliven us and who write dull prose. In celebration of Dr. Kissinger's an elegant raconteur of the history in which he played so significant a role, we have agreed to spend 1 hour a day without a single reference to Kosovo. We happily confine ourselves to his book, Years of Renewal. I thought to explore with him, in particular, two fascinating questions. One of them personal, the other of general interest, especially to conservatives. I begin by asking Dr. Kissinger to tell us how his book handles the special problem of Richard Nixon and the tapes. And then we will discuss with him the historical problem of détente. But first, does a study of the tapes tell us comprehensively what Nixon was like?
No, I think it gives a very one-sided picture of one facet of Nixon's personality. I believe that President Nixon will be considered by history as one of the seminal presidents in the design and execution of foreign policy. But he had some personality aspects, which I don't know from what they derived, since I only met him after he had been elected. But he had a great fear of being rejected face to face. He had a need to affirm himself with dramatic statements. He had a tendency to adapt his tone to that of his interlocutor. And all of these tendencies come to appearance in the tapes. Grandiloquent statements, which were meant for effect, or maybe for somebody writing it down so that they could repeat them later. Quick reactions to an immediate situation, but they gave a totally misleading impression, because when you knew Nixon,
You knew he could deliberate.
you knew the decisions he meant to take were taken with maddening deliberation, extending over periods of weeks while he sat in his private study, not the Oval Office, and wrote out options on endless sheets of paper, because he didn't particularly like to meet people, which is unusual for a politician. And he might call me 10 times or more a night going over those options. When he did that, I knew he meant to act. On other occasions, he was perfectly capable of firing off a string of orders, which those who knew never would have carried out. If you read, for example, the transcripts of the Pentagon Papers, And you can read some blood-curdling pronouncements. But what is never pointed out is none of them were carried out. And none of the people who heard it said, yes, Mr. President, we'll do it tomorrow morning. Or reported back to him the next day that they did even the slightest execution of them. And
he was just externalizing a frustration.
A frustration, and to try to show that he meant to do something. And moreover, on the Pentagon Papers, I believe that in his attitude, not in his conclusions, he was right. Most people don't know that the Pentagon Papers were in no way damaging to Richard Nixon. They all concerned the previous administration. And if he had wanted to play straight politics, he could have said it's deplorable that these papers are out. But now you, ladies and gentlemen, see what I inherited and why I have such a tough time. He felt that he had to protect the classification system. He could not accept the proposition that anything that could be stolen could be printed. And so, with some measures that one would not necessarily approve, he tried to stop that flood by going to court. Then he gave another set of random orders, none of which were carried out, or even begun to be carried out, nor did he ever inquire about them afterwards.
Well, also some people took initiatives which we have no reason to suppose he'd have confirmed, right, in setting up the plumbers, well, in Watergate.
The plumbers, like so much in the Nixon White House, the plumbers, there was nothing wrong with the plumbers as such. Their job was to trace leaks, and they were called plumbers because of the leak problem. They were not themselves given an illegal charge. Same with that list of people that he didn't want to be invited to White House dinners. Every White House has that in one way or another. They called it in the Nixon White House enemies list. And, but its significance was a list of people not to be invited to White House dinners. When Watergate blew up, and even though my office was right next to Haldeman's, foreign policy and domestic policy were kept strictly separate. So when I became aware of the full extent of Watergate, I called up Bryce Harlow, who was a wise older man in Washington in those days. He had been legislative aide to Eisenhower, and he knew Nixon well. And I said, Bryce, what do you think happened here? And he said, some fool went into the Oval Office and did what he was told. and this is what one has to understand in assessing the case. Nixon is much more reliable in the memoranda he wrote. They're much more analytical.
Those had staying powers and were intended to endure.
Those were intended, the majority of them, as instructions, as reflections.
Well, you spoke in written here about the odd need of Mr. Nixon to have somebody in the room listening to him from time to time, even though what he was engaged in was primarily soliloquies, and how Haldeman would try to dodge full-time duty here. You would have to try.
Yeah, it was a funny thing. If you read about most White Houses, you will see that the White House staff is trying for the maximum time with the president because this determines influence. Those few of us who had regular access to Nixon had exactly the opposite incentive because once you got in, you might not get out for hours. And so we were almost hoping for some crisis to erupt to take us.
But in the course of these, I call them soliloquies, were you mentioned one specific case, were you able to penetrate to what was a crystallizing position of his, or was he simply just thinking out loud?
It depends. Sometimes one met and he was simply recounting events of his life. And they were interesting and important for understanding him. But after some repetition, one became familiar with them. He used them to relieve tension, and on other issues, one would have to separate two aspects. If he was analyzing a problem, one could get a very good idea of his way of thinking. When he was deciding on a specific course of action, then one had to be careful, because he did not ever want to be in a face-to-face confrontation with another person. So if he had any idea at all that let's say, me being there, I wanted to go in one direction, then you could not be sure that what he said would necessarily be what he would have preferred. It was very well geared to what I preferred. And therefore, once I understood this, after the first month or two, we never made big decisions in face-to-face conversations. We'd have a conversation and he'd analyze the problem as he saw it. I would then write a memorandum and say, here is the issue, and maybe add my own analysis. And here are 2, 3, 4 choices you have. You could trust his answer if it was in writing. You could not be sure of his answer when it was face to face.
He intended everything written to be lapidary in nature. It should survive.
Yes.
And direct.
Yes.
Oh, now, you mentioned here his antipathy to the Ivy League establishment.
Yes.
Is that because it was fancied or real?
No, it was a strange relationship. He had actually more reverence for the Ivy League establishment than I did. I was familiar with them. He thought they were extremely hostile to him, which was more or less true. On the other hand, he was very eager to be accepted by them. And I asked at one point in this book the rhetorical question, what would have happened if the establishment which he both feared and revered had shown him some affection and had not treated him with, on the whole, the hostility that they did treat him. When Harvard University blew up, he said to me, I'm glad this happened at Harvard, but not because he wished Harvard ill, but because he said they will know how to deal with it, and they will set an example for the rest of the university. I said, Mr. President, I know that faculty. Within 3 days,
Chicago for that.
Within 3 days, nobody will know who did what to whom, and it will be absolutely confused. And so he considered them hostile, but he actually deep down respected them.
Respected them because of their class standing or because of their continuing record of accomplishments?
No, more because of their class standing. And one of his frustrations, one of the things he genuinely found hard to understand is why the best, what he considered the best people in the society, were so committed to a defeat of America in a war that they had started. Because he inherited a war which was more or less started by the group brought in by Kennedy and Johnson. And he couldn't really grasp the fact that in his administration they were really advocating courses of action that amounted to unilateral abandonment of millions who had...
There was no easy answer to that, was there?
There is no easy answer. There's still no easy answer to that.
Let me ask you about another chapter in your book which interested me a lot, and that was about the problem of, quote, détente. Détente say there was something very much opposed by militant conservatives because they understood it as a movement of sort of asking really that the goal of anti-communist policy becomes subsidiary to other interests. Now, in your book, you explain always your motives in every situation. But what was it that the conservatives did that was troublesome when Ford took over and you proceeded with the post-Vietnam policies?
Well, let me describe what led us to our policies. When we inherited the Vietnam War, we found the country in the throes of violent protests at regular intervals designed to paralyze the government, assaults on universities, and a movement in which most of the media and the majority of the intellectuals were beginning to veer towards the proposition that there was something inherently warlike in the American government, and that the real issue was not the particular crisis we face, but how to civilize the American government. So we thought one of our obligations was to separate the problem of peace in Vietnam, on which there were not that many realistic possibilities in the short run, from a general commitment to peace, so that the American public would understand that when tensions arose, they were imposed on us and not sought by us. Secondly, we thought analytically that history was on our side, that we had all the industrial democracies, in fact all the developed countries. We tried to add the most populous country in the world, China, to us. And so we thought that the Soviet system was likely to be affected more than we.
By the attritions of history.
By the attritions of history. That was our basic motivation. Where Nixon, and I suppose I made a mistake, was this. Nixon took, I believe if Nixon had explained our strategy carefully to leading conservatives, he could have found acquiescence to what was, after all, a strategy for conducting an adversarial relationship. We never had any question about the challenge of communism. We were always determined to resist any communist expansion, and we did, in many places.
Not in Vietnam, but we
tried. We tried in Vietnam, we did in Angola, we did in, when they established a submarine base we tried to establish a submarine base in Cuba, we did it in Chile. I mean, wherever we perceived that communism was expanding, we did our utmost to resist it. But Nixon derived a great satisfaction out of stealing the liberal program for different motives than the liberals. The liberals thought the communist system was really changing. He never thought that. But he adopted a lot of the liberal rhetoric, and that was unnecessarily grating with the conservatives. And all of us, including me, and especially maybe me, we took it so much for granted that the conservatives understood what we were doing, that we really spent more time cultivating the liberals in the Congress than the conservatives. So this, I think, was now...
Which resulted in a misunderstanding.
And that then led to a misunderstanding. Secondly, Americans, including American conservatives, tend to think in foreign policy more in absolute terms. The essence of our policy was to say, we are now in a process in which the accumulation of nuances will define the outcome. and in which our values will be tested by our capacity to sustain them. Many traditional American views, and especially conservative views, saw it rather as a confrontation between good and evil. And therefore, the appearance of accommodation with the Soviet Union, they made them restless.
Sort of sounded a capitulationist.
And they also were afraid that it would weaken the ability of the American public to resist. And so we got into this strange situation. The analysis of many, especially neoconservatives, was that we were on the verge of confronting a cataclysmic onslaught, and that our biggest danger was a general nuclear war. We thought the biggest danger was a gradual expansion of the Soviet sphere, and that in fact in the nuclear field we were relatively safe, and there were more margins for negotiation. Even with this, almost every weapon system, every strategic weapon system now in the American arsenal was started in the Ford and Nixon administrations, except missile defense, which we began to develop and to deploy, and which was stopped in effect by the Congress, leading us to the ABM agreement.
But what was this fear of, how did this fear of détente manifest itself as an obstacle in pursuit of the foreign policy?
It manifested itself in, there were some, especially neoconservatives, who developed extraordinary skill in finding alleged flaws in agreements that were made, and some of them were so esoteric that
the Jackson Bill, which you
that we couldn't win because there were, for example, 60 Soviet nuclear submarines that were diesel engines and that were so noisy that you could hear them with our listening devices across the Atlantic, and that hadn't left port for years. And we didn't want the Soviets to give themselves credit for abolishing them because we weren't worried about them. So we established a special regimen for them as a separate category. This was what we thought was a good negotiation by us. Some of the critics then found a phrase according to which if the Soviets put a very modern missile on this very old submarine, the agreement might not apply. I then had to give our explanation to stupefied journalists who didn't understand what I was talking about and couldn't care, and then they wrote in a defensive briefing. So this sort of thing tended to undermine credibility. And what was worst was this: the crises that we thought were most threatening, the collapse of Indochina, the Cuban penetration of Angola. In none of them did we get real conservative support. And so we considered, I always considered myself a conservative. And the people that we thought should be our allies were aloof. And the others had always been our opponents. So that was nothing new. So that was a frustration, but we probably contributed to it.
To what extent was that precipitated by what some people thought of an inordinate intimacy and cordiality in your Peking visit?
Well, including you. One of my more dismaying experiences was when I gave a press conference in Shanghai and Mr. Buckley was sitting in the front row of the journalists, saying nothing but raising his eyebrows in a way that it probably contributed to this. We thought, I mean, to us, the essence of the Chinese strategy at that point was to isolate the Soviet Union and to split the two communist giants from each other. But it's quite possible, in fact, quite likely, that it was done more exuberantly than was necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Henry Kissinger, author of Years of Renewal. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about a video cassette of this program, write to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205, or call 803-799-3449. That's Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205, or call 803-799-3449.